Aproove Concoord. Xavier, all yours.
Thank you, Sylvain, and hello, everybody. So we are pretty proud to introduce Concoord to you guys, even though we already spoke about it to some of you. Now we have kind of a proper setup to show and go through. So the challenges about Concoord is trying to solve uh, every challenges related to integration between SaaS products. Okay, so the thing is that many applications are siloed and not really extensible, and Aproove is not kind of being different than many other solutions, and that's the reason why we've been working on a global solution for answering any question related to integration from Aproove or to Aproove, or even autonomous integration that will sit inside Aproove. So Concoord can be classified as an iPaaS platform, but can be also classified as a middleware layer, depending on how you see it. But through the different use case we will go through today, I think you will have a much better understanding of what it is, because it's a very powerful platform, like Silva introduced. Um, the solution has been built on an industry standard system, iPaaS system, that we have deeply integrated inside the Aproove ecosystem. So it will integrate seamlessly in your existing environment, in your existing workflows, and out of the box. The beauty of this is that out of the box we have already more than 3,000 available function and connectors inside Concoord due to this heritage of the legacy technology. So thank you for the diagram, Sylvain. So if you want to see something about, let me check this. Yeah, if you want to see Concoord from a higher angle perspective, Concoord is not the first piece of the puzzle for when it's time to talk about integration with Aproove. We have since years developed different integrations that are more or less generic through using API possibilities like the RPC API, which is the preferred API we all use internally. We have also REST API. We have developed a few Adobe plugins. We have a few connection to storages. And of course, what you guys are all using are the workflows that are automating a lot of different things. So Concoord is kind of a new piece, much more generic, which will be the place where you will integrate to Aproove or from Aproove, depending on the direction of integration you guys are expecting. So the goal of Concoord is definitely to be an intermediate layer. This is called a middleware at this point, where this middleware will be able to do a lot of different things, not only connecting, but also doing a lot of different kind of processing that you will be able to program. Yeah, one thing to say about Concoord is that it is qualified as a no-code/low-code platform, which means that you don't need to be a developer in order to use it. It's literally assembling Legos together and connecting them to each other to get somewhere with it. Of course, when it starts becoming a little bit more sophisticated, you can use some coding. The native coding inside Concoord is JavaScript, which is pretty popular today. And like I said, it is for going out of Aproove or inside Aproove, which will be demonstrated by Sylvain. So I think we can go to the next thing, Sylvain. A little base definition about what is Concoord, what are the elements inside Concoord. So everything in Concoord is called a flow. So as soon as you will start assembling some Legos in Concoord, the overall result will be a flow. The Legos, the blocks, are the nodes, called nodes, that you will see in a minute. And the link between those different nodes are connectors. And those connectors are creating the links between the different elements of a flow. And so if we go in a bigger diagram, you see this is exactly how it will appear in the Aproove UI when you will start building those flows. So they look like this. Simply the little blocks, which are the different nodes. Like I said, out of the box, 3,000 plus of these nodes exist already for doing any kind of thing you may imagine. You connect those blocks together with connectors, and the ensemble of all these things is called a flow. You can build as many flow as you want inside Concoord. So to kind of categorize what can be covered by Concoord, the different Concoord flow, we have different types of trigger in there. So whether it is outgoing from Aproove, meaning Aproove is doing a call to a third-party system with some intermediate processing made by Concoord. For doing so, we use a call Concoord action that you will be able to insert in any of your workflows, your running workflows. Another direction is from a third-party system to Aproove, to Concoord at some point. For that, we will use kind of a webhooks capabilities that will be triggered from a third-party system. So we call that an input flow. And when it's not triggered from Aproove or from a third party, you can have an autonomous kind of flow running inside Concoord that will do some processing, and the data needed are from Aproove or from a third-party system, and the aggregation, the processing is done inside Concoord in an autonomous way without being triggered by the third-party system or by Aproove. We'll demonstrate all of this. So to continue on a few diagrams here, outgoing type would be, like I said, an action that you will insert such action between steps in the workflow or as an input of any step in the workflow. So moving from step 1 to step 2, in between, in the transition, you will invoke, for example, a call Concoord action that will trigger a flow in Concoord that will do something with a third-party system. That's a very basic example. We'll demonstrate all of that in a minute. Next one is a third-party system invoking an input flow automatically from the external world. So at some point, Concoord will expose a webhook that will be callable by a third-party system. We have plenty of security there. It's not simply open to the outside world, but the concept is that a third-party system will be able to invoke anything in Concoord that will end up interacting with Aproove internally. When I say interacting with Aproove, it means interacting with API, Aproove API, because we have developed a dedicated node for Aproove API inside Concoord, and also interact with the SQL database in Aproove or even the file system of Aproove. And last but not least, very different one, when it's not invoked at all, not triggered by Aproove or not triggered by a third-party system, but triggered by Concoord itself, with kind of a very easy example of that is a timer. So every X minute, every hour, something executes in Concoord, which is kind of looking inside Aproove or looking at a third-party system and does something. Something being, for example, notifying people in Aproove or notifying people in a third-party system. This is what Sylvain will also demonstrate in a minute. So in order to start and to show you the easiness, we won't build all the flow during the webinar, because otherwise we will lose a lot of time. We waste a lot of time in these things, because some may take some time to be built. But to show you the easiness, how efficient it is to create a flow, we have prepared a proper live creation of a flow, very basic one, which will be the use case one here that Sylvain will demonstrate in a sec. So you guys that have used already the Aproove API, you always have struggled at some point to call Aproove or to maintain an API token up and running, or a session open, and all these things. We'll show you in a minute how to do such things in Concoord. You will see how easy it is. And for doing so, I give the stick now to Sylvain.
Thank you, Xavier. All right, so let's switch over to Aproove. We've got Aproove up and running here. So you'll notice that we've got a Concoord application in the admin. So you can just click on that. That gives you 3 options. The first option essentially just reports on the status and the version of what's underlying in Concoord. You've got the list of nodes that are available here, and you can add your own nodes. So you can download nodes and install them on the system. but it already comes with a whole bunch of nodes already pre-installed. And then you have your list of flows. This is where we'll spend most of our time. So right now we have 3 flows already created. These are the 3 examples that will provide you, the next 3 examples we'll give. But we'll start off by creating a new one here, just to show you how easy it is. So as Xavier was mentioning, there's different types of actions that we can create, different types of flows. An input flow that has a webhook or an action that will be available to the workflow. So I'll create one that's an input, just as an example, list projects. So just create one that will just essentially provide you with a list of projects. And then let's give it project list as the endpoint. So this would be the endpoint that gets called to, and I think I will use this nomenclature or case. All right, so I will just add this flow. And as you can see, it gets added. Xavier mentioned there's a built-in security. So there's a security token here that you can rotate as well. This will be used for authentication with this endpoint. So it's not just an open endpoint that anybody can just call. You actually need the security token, the Aproove token, to be part of that call to make sure that only approved third-party applications are able to make the call. So when you create a flow, we will pre-populate it with the basic building blocks or Lego blocks, like Xavier called them, that you need to get started, which will contain the route itself, check the token, check the different routes that are available to it. And we'll walk through that in a minute, as well as the actual core of it. But just to show you how easy it is to make an API call, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create, just going to drop an Aproove RPC node here. And on it, I'm double clicking on it to go to the properties, and let's call it list projects. And then you can give it the URL to the Aproove server, but if you leave it blank, it'll just run on the local host, which is the server. So just put in my username and a password for a user that has access to the API. I will select the API object that I want to query, and in this case, it's the project. And then this will populate the different methods I've got. So I want to list the projects, and it is a post method, so you can have post or get, depending on what the API documentation says. And I will turn on debugging, just because I'm going to run it and show you the output of that in our debug window here. So this one's done. And to be able to see the output, I will create a new node here and add a debug node right after. So as you can see, all of the nodes are connected. And the way the system works is that it will, once this one gets triggered, it will do something and then send a message to the next node here, which then does something else, sends it to the next one. This particular one will validate, for example, the approved token. And if the token's not right, it routes it to here, which sends a 401 error, saying you're not authenticated, you're not a valid user. If it's valid, then it goes to the check route, which also does some things and validates the route and allows you to route the workflow, the flow to different portions or different routes or different other nodes. So you can have something very complex or very simple, like I'm building right here. And then to trigger this, I could make the call and then route it all, but instead, this is very useful when testing. You can use this inject node. So this inject block will essentially trigger the workflow or trigger this part. So I'll just connect it to that. So when I trigger this timestamp, it'll essentially send the timestamp to the list project API call, which doesn't really care about the timestamp, but it'll just process whatever it needs to do. So it'll make the call I asked it and then send the output to the debug node here. And so that should be all I need to do. So I will deploy this, which is essentially saving it to the server, making it live. And I've got my debug window here. So you've got different tabs. So you want to make sure you're on the debug tab. And I can just click this little button here on this timestamp or this inject node. It's a little bit special. It's got this button here that you can click to trigger this branch. So I'll do that. And as you can see, it ran the API call. It gave me a whole bunch of stuff. But the payload, the last one here, that's the important thing. And if I open this up, I've got an array of one object. And this is my one project that I've got in my Aproove server. So if I log into my Aproove server here, you'll notice that I do have just one project. And it's project ID 5. I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is ID 5, which is essentially what this is returning me. ID 5, the name of the travel brochure, and a lot of information on this project. So you could have, for example, another node that takes this object, does something else with it, and then reacts to it and sends you information differently or sends it to an external system. So this is a very simple example of how you can make an API call quite quickly to Aproove. As you can see underneath here, it does keep the session alive. So if I run it again, let me clear this up. If I run it again, it will use the same session. I don't have to recreate a new session and then pass the token, the login, cookie, and PHP session, and all that fun stuff you need to do when you're working with API. This Aproove RPC node handles all of that for you just by putting in a username and a password that has access to the API. All right, let's go back to our slides here. And then we'll continue on with the other examples. This next one is an example of how you can make a call to a Concoord action within a workflow that will perform an action on a third-party system. In this case, we're using Slack. Essentially, what we're doing here is whenever a project changes status, so it goes from one status to another, we have a dedicated Slack channel that will get updated. So instead of sending an email to a whole bunch of people, we just notify them through Slack. So that's a use case we've heard could be useful. And then to set this up, we've got, this is the example we're going to be showing. So essentially, whenever there's a change, so this is the action that gets kicked off, the node that gets kicked off when the action gets called by the workflow, it will check the route, and we'll show you the routes here. And then we'll go to the param function that's essentially sets some of the parameters that are needed for the next node, which builds the actual message to send to Slack. And then we've got an API call to the Slack API. And then we return the 200 message to Aproove saying, okay, everything worked fine. I was able to send the message. So that's pretty much what we're going to be showing. So let's just dive right in. And let me go back in here. So before I jump into the flow, let me just quickly show you what we did in Slack. So we've got in our application, we've got an application in our Slack domain or work group. And in this application, it's all set up with tokens. And this is essentially, you just click a button, create an application, give it a name. And it's pretty much that easy. And then we've turned on webhooks, incoming webhooks. This is how Slack works. And then it gives me a URL here that I can call. Whenever I call this URL, it's linked to this Concoord webinar channel. So I can go take a look at this channel. Right now it's empty. And so let's dive into our flow. And so I will open up my flow on Notify Slack on project status change. So whenever you click on that little arrow button, it essentially loads all of the nodes and will load the flow itself. And so this is what we have here. So we've got the first one here that this is the node that gets called. We have some variables that we've set up, and that's some of the, if you double click on the title, it will show you some, it'll have some default values here, environment variables. The important one here that I wanted to show was the routes, the different routes. So if I open this up here, it's got one route called send project status update that has 3 parameters. These are important, so you can set these up, and this is all part of the documentation. This is essentially which parameter is this action from the workflow going to expect. So it's going to expect the project ID, the project name, and the project status when you call the route send project status update. You could theoretically, well, actually, you could have several different routes within the same action, and each of those routes would have different parameters. And I'll show you what it looks like in Aproove when we set up that action afterwards.
Can I add something? Just
Yes,
one thing on this. So you should not worry too much about that, because as soon as you create a flow from the admin, Aproove will pre-populate all these things for you, so you don't need to remind that. You will
yeah,
have to customize it, of course, to match your needs and your expectation. But all of this is part of the convention of working, and this is all created out of the box. You see all this flow here. You see action template V1 on the top left corner. Just because when you hit the button create flow in Aproove, it will create all of this for you. All you have to do is understanding, of course, what it does and what you want to achieve, but just have to go through each of the nodes, setting up things for it to work as expected. So
yeah,
just wanted to say that, because it may sound a little bit magical that you require a lot of knowledge to do that. In fact, you don't need too much knowledge. Most of the not the inconvenience have been kind of taken over by the integration here. When you hit add flow, bang, you had all of this pre-configured already. Up to you to tune it after.
right. And
Sorry
then
for
the
that.
different routes that you've added, when you do a check route, this node, essentially what it does is it looks at the route that you call and will route the flow to the different uh, areas, so the different branches. So we have one called send project status. So if that's the route that we pick in the action, this is what gets sent to the flow, and then that sends it to the first, essentially the first route, the first branch. Otherwise, it sends everything to branch 2, which you can see here. Branch 1 is here, it goes up here. Branch 2 goes to 404, not found, essentially returns a 404 error. And then this node here, all it does is it takes certain parameters that have been passed and sets them to variables that will be available to the next node. So this is essentially setting up some of the variables that are needed. Again, this is already pre-built into the template that you get when you create an action, a flow. This is where some of the magic happens, these next 2 nodes. So this one is a function node. Essentially, it takes the variables that were just set up in the previous one and sets them up as variable within this script. And then the API, the webhook from Slack expects a certain format. So it expects a JSON format with the text property of what you want to send as a message. So essentially, we're creating a URL here to the server that points to the project ID, and it says the project name with the ID in parentheses is now in status and provides the status here. So it just uses these variables here to build this message. And then it essentially passes that message on to the next node, which is the node that actually sends the Slack message. And then this node is essentially one of these HTTP request nodes that we've just dropped in, linked them together. And then if you open this up, all it's got is it does a post to this webhook. That's the link that I got out of our Slack application. And by default, this will just take whatever is in the body of the previous message and send it as the body of this HTTP request. So you don't have to put that in either. The only thing we had to do was make sure the header had the content type of JSON, because the body is in JSON format. And then importantly, tell Aproove that everything worked. So we send back the HTTP 200 back to Aproove so that the workflow knows that everything worked fine. If there's an error, it'll give you a 404, or if there's any other errors that aren't handled in here, we've got this catch node here that essentially catches any errors, and then we'll send out the error back to Aproove, as well as give us some debugging. So one of the really nice things that we can do with Concoord is we can actually see the flow working live while it's in here. If you turn on debugging and you're in the debug node here, the debug tab, you'll actually see the messages as the node gets executed. So we could give it a try. So let's create a project here. Let's go back in here. I got logged out. Log back in. And let's create a new project. And conveniently, I've got a project here that has the action. And then we'll go back after I'll show you how I configured this action. I just want you guys to see it in action. Let's call it test project 100, and then just launch it. And then let's go back to Slack. And as you can see, the project, I got a notification that says, okay, the project is currently in this status, which is the first status of this project. So going back into Aproove, let me show you, you're probably familiar already with how the workflows work and how actions work. So we have essentially what we did is in our project creation phase, as well as all of the other phases, what we did is we added an action that gets executed when the step on input, meaning it gets executed whenever we go into that step. And then what this action does is it calls a Concoord flow. It's a Concoord call. So that's one of the types of triggers that we had. So we set it up. And because we can pick here which one we want, and then by picking this notify Slack on project status change, this is our flow that we created. It already knows these are the routes that are available in this flow. We only have the one that we created, so that one gets selected. But by selecting it, it shows me, okay, these are the values that it's expecting. It wants the project ID, the project name, the project status. And I've set those to values, so you can set those to internal tags, to metadata value if you've got different metadata, so you can combine these things, these values. So right now I'm just sending the internal tag of the project ID to this. Oops, I just changed it here. Let me go back to here, project ID, and remove the 0. So it sends the project ID here, sends the project name to the project name key, and then the current step name, which is this name here, this is what gets sent to project status, and then the flow will just take that and use it. So it's not very complicated. It's essentially just adding this action to all the different steps of this workflow. And then the same action gets triggered every time there's a change of workflow status. And then you get notified in Slack. Hopefully that is not too complicated. I don't see any questions or raised hands, so I'm assuming this is pretty common. So if you do have any questions, just add them to the Q&A panel, and then we'll try to get to them. If they're related directly to the portion that we're showing, we can probably elaborate a little bit more. If not, we can answer them at the end as well. All right. So moving on, we go back to here. The next example we want to talk about is a little bit more complex. It's an input flow. It's not driven by an API call per se. So there's no API call that's made directly to Aproove Concoord, but it's actually triggered by something, a node called well, it's essentially a Dropbox node that will take a look at. Okay, is the sound okay? Because I'm
Yeah,
getting a comment.
all good, Seba. All
Okay,
good.
all right. I'm getting a comment that the sound is hard to understand, but okay. All right, so this next example, we created a hot folder out of Dropbox, essentially, that will, we have a node that watches watches a folder on Dropbox. Whenever a file is dropped into it, it will get a link from that file directly from Dropbox, and it doesn't download the file directly in the flow. It actually just gets a link, creates a project, and adds that file to the project, essentially adding the link to the file. And then the agent, the Aproove agent, will get that link and then download it directly. So let's, this
It
is
would
what it would look.
just mimic the hot folder behavior that from the old days, but from a cloud
Yes.
drive, which is pretty impressive because it's all event driven, and it is without any kind of polling. It is all event driven, which is really nice, really powerful.
Yeah. So essentially, this is what the flow looks like. As you can see, we put a lot of debug nodes in there. This is useful for when you're building it, but it's also very useful in demonstration to actually see what's going on here. So let me just jump right in, and I'll show you this this node. So let's go back to our flows. Yeah, I can discard that. I don't want to save anything. So to Dropbox hot folder. So let's open this up. And there we go. So the first thing that it does, it's essentially this is what kicks off this flow, is a watch Dropbox for new PDF files. This is what I'd call it. Essentially, I'm filtering on PDF, so I only want PDF files. And then it's got my Dropbox account credentials set up. So it's set up to connect to my Dropbox account. And then the next node here will check every time there's an event regarding a PDF, this flow kicks off. If the event is we just added a file, because sometimes it'll kick off if I delete a PDF as well. So I only care about the events where I'm adding a PDF. So if that's the case, then it'll continue. This thing, this node here, this function node will extract the file name from, if I'll open it up, all it does is extracts the file name and sends that. It builds the message for the next node, which makes a call to the Dropbox API to, let me open this up here, to get the temporary link to the file. It doesn't download the file, it just gets the link to it and then creates, there's another function node. So it passes it on to the function node here, which prepares the API body for the project create and upload file. So this is how the Aproove API project create call is expecting. So this is the body. So it needs like the name. What do we want to name, give it? So we'll use the name of the file. We're using config ID 20. We've hard coded it, but it could be based on the type of file. So you could, for example, have another node that decides based on what type of file or the file name, do I want to use a different config? So you can have all that parameterized here. And then we send the URL to the file and then give it the file name. So this essentially prepares the call. This is what actually sets up, creates the project, and then sends the 200 response back just to end the flow. So I'm going to leave this open here and switch to Dropbox. And this is my Dropbox account. Let me just refresh, make sure I'm logged in. Yep. And let's upload a file. Let's pick this one here. Let's upload this file. And then let's quickly go back in here and you'll see it. As you can see, it was pretty quick, but essentially all it does is here, it you see the different messages, and as you hover over them, actually highlights which debug node is showing you this. So this is the initial message we got from Dropbox. This is the getting the file name part because it was an ad. The event was an ad, so it got the file name. It continued. This one got the download link to from Dropbox. This particular node prepared the body to make the call. So this is the body of the API call we're going to make to create the project. And then this creates the project. And this one has the login as well. So it logs in to approve, it creates the post, it runs that, gives the payload. So it's got a whole bunch of different things. And then eventually the last thing here that we see is it created a project called using the name of the file, and then project ID is 82. And so if we go back to approve, I should see my project that got created here, and it should start processing that file. Oh no, that's the test project I created earlier. Sorry, hold on. There we go. This is the project that just got created, project 82. It added the file to it that it downloaded from our Dropbox, and then I've got the proof here directly in Approve without having to upload the file itself. And then it started that. Because this uses the same config as the previous example, if I go back in here, I've got these two messages. So when the project got created, my trigger to send the status automatically did that. But because the proof got uploaded automatically, I also started the proofing workflow, which went into step A1. So I can show that if I go onto this workflow, I've got a task here. We're here, so I should have a task assigned to me. Yep. If I start my task and then move it to the next, as you can see, it's not a very complex workflow, but just by moving it to the next, this is enough to trigger this other message directly. So a couple of examples here of how you can use Concoord. It doesn't have to be just one flow. You can have multiple flows acting within your same project. So this is a little bit more complex. Obviously, it's not a full-blown hot folder mechanism, but for some just for demonstration purposes, it does demonstrate that you can do some pretty cool things with some of these nodes.
You probably noticed the speed of all of this. It was very hard to show you the progression. Just moving from window to window, it was already done on the other side. So it's very, very fast.
Yeah, you've got the timestamps here. So all of this was done within a second, and then once the call was made, like 4 seconds later, the project was created and the file was uploaded to it. And most of these 4 seconds was essentially just downloading the file to the system. All right. So let's go back to our examples and let's continue on. We still have one more example that we want to share with you. Again, we're going to talk about Slack. This one's an autonomous call using a timer. It's essentially we're going to send a Slack notification every hour and verify if any tasks are about to expire. And for each of those tasks, it will send a message in the Slack channel, essentially calling out the person for not completing their task or telling them, hey, you don't have a lot of time to complete your task. Again, it's a very simple example. This one will show you how we'll use the inject. We'll trigger it manually using the inject, but you can also trigger it with what we call a cron job, which is essentially a timer. So you can have that running on a timer completely independent of any workflow actions or API calls. And then when that happens, it builds the message in the similar manner. to what we saw in the first example or the second example with Slack, and then sends it to Slack using the same mechanism, the same webhook mechanism. So let's jump right into that. And we'll go back here. And it's notify Slack on task expiration. This is my example I'm going to show. All right, so in this example, as you can see what triggers it, I've got two different types of trigger. This one is a cron job that's scheduled and runs every hour. So if I double click on it, it's essentially I can set up different schedules here, but essentially this means run every hour. So this one will run automatically. Obviously, for this demo, we don't want to wait an hour, so we will just hit it off, trigger it with this inject node. What this does is it will run an SQL query directly. So I've got a Postgres node here. So you can run it on the reporting. You can use a reporting schema and then execute. It's a fairly, well, the query looks a bit complex. It's just because I'm tweaking the time left based on how much time is left, how many hours and minutes, and all that. So you don't want to say there's like 180 minutes. You want to say 3 hours, but then when you get down to the minutes, you want to say how many minutes. So this is what this does. But it essentially just gets the tasks that are expiring in the next 100 hours, and then because this can return several records, several tasks, I've got a split node here that will essentially kick off the rest of the branch for every single one of the records that was returned. So if I have 5 records that are returned that are expiring, the split node here will essentially kick off the rest of this 5 times. And for each of those times, it will essentially build a payload with the record, the job ID, the task name, the record ID of the task, the first name and the last name of the person and their email, and when it expires. So this expire message, that was the part in the SQL query that was a bit more complex because it built this based on so that it looked prettier in Slack. And then sends that to Slack exactly the same way as we did in the other example using the same webhook here. And so I can trigger this, and because I've got projects that are existing, it should trigger. And yep, it ran and it had 2 tasks that are expiring soon. So if I go back here, as you can see, my 2 tasks are expiring within 23 hours, so in less than a day, which is what I've set them up for. So another small example of how you can interact with different systems based on data coming from Aproove. All right, so back to our slides. Couple of things. You've noticed that I put a lot of debug nodes in my flows. They're really good for helping you understand how things are progressing, how nodes are talking to each other, the messages that they're sending to each other, making sure things are formatted correctly. So use debug nodes as it's like salt. Like you can never have enough of it. So put a lot of debug nodes on everything. You also want to make sure you always end your flow in Concoord with a response node, which an HTTP response node. For those of you that know a little bit of coding, you know that a response 200 means everything's okay. So essentially, once you end your branch, you want to send a HTTP 200 code back to Aproove or to your calling system because it's going to be waiting for a response whenever it makes an API call. Aproove does the same thing. It will launch the flow and then expect to get a response from it. So it will look for 200 or anything else than a 200 would be considered error code, like a 400 would be authentication issue or permissions issue. 500 would be a proper error unhandled exception. So you want to make sure you send back a code so that Aproove doesn't stay there waiting, or that your external system just stays there waiting. By default, Aproove has a timeout. It will time out after, by default, 1 minute, I believe. But you don't want to leave it waiting. You want it to actually respond really quickly if there's an issue or not. And then when you're testing API calls, whether it's API to calls to your third-party system, or if you're creating a flow, an input flow that has a URL to make API calls to, you don't necessarily want to have to go through all the hoops in your third-party system to make those calls, to trigger them, especially when you're testing things out. So tools like Postman are very helpful to test all of those API calls. So they work very well to make calls in either direction. And that is about it for